Mr. Firestein is the inaugural president and CEO of the Houston-based U.S China Foundation. It has a longer title, right? Okay, George Bush, whatever. Okay, and then before that, he was actually the founding executive director of the China Public Policy Center at UT Austin, and then clinical professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Earlier, so I skip a whole bunch of things that David did. Mr. Firestein spent nearly 2 decades in the U.S. Foreign Service, including serving in the U.S. embassies in Beijing and Moscow, right? And I believe you can speak both Chinese and Russian. Okay, and he has garnered numerous honors during his diplomatic career. And he's also a published author, which I didn't know until recently. And most impressively, among his publications are 2 Chinese language bestsellers that were published in China. Okay, I can't but feel especially proud when presenting this to you because David was once a student in my advanced Chinese language and literature course. You know, you have us here, and to kind of review. We have invited him back many times, right, during his career. So he would talk to us, the current changes in China. I still vividly remember a lot of things that during the last almost 30 years, right, 30 years, right? Okay, so let me kind of welcome the most distinguished alumnus of the Asian Study Graduate Program.
Well, Yvonne, thank you so much for the really gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. And it is wonderful to be back here at my alma mater. It's a special privilege and a great feeling of really coming home. And as Yvonne noted, she was one of my finest professors here at the University of Texas more than 30 years ago. I think it was 31 years ago and change. And it was a wonderful course, and I learned so much from Professor Chang and used so much of that in the course of my work with China and the Chinese language over the course of my career. So it really is just a delight to be back here. And I'm so grateful to Yvonne and to Leon and all my friends here at Asian Studies for giving me the chance to come back. I was actually the first student ever to matriculate into what was then the brand new joint master's program between the LBJ School and Asian Studies. It literally started the semester that I came here. And I also ended up being the first to graduate because through an interesting confluence of efforts and circumstances, I was able to finish a 3-year program in 2 years. In fact, I finished up my academic work basically exactly 30 years ago, almost to the day, before joining the Foreign Service in the United States Foreign Service in late September 1992. So this is a moment to think back and to be grateful for the incredible professors and the incredible things I learned here at the wonderful University of Texas and now the Center for Taiwan Studies. As Yvonne mentioned, the topic of Taiwan is certainly quite timely and I would say topical and resonant. I think all of us are aware that Taiwan has been in the news a pretty fair amount recently. And I thought it would be a great opportunity to come and speak about Taiwan in a way that perhaps is a little different from what we often hear. One of the things that is interesting about the topic of Taiwan as an issue in U.S. China Relations is that there are a whole bunch of set phrases and formulations that typically have to be used by the governments. The U.S. government has its own very specific and carefully crafted one China policy and set of policies and approaches to the issue of Taiwan, and literally every syllable has to be said in a certain way, a certain order. There's a kind of a catechism to it. And likewise, China has its long-held positions and so on. But what I've come to understand over a period of some time is that the reality is sometimes those diplomatic formulations and that kind of staid language gets in the way of really understanding what's actually happening in the relationship. And so hence the subtitle of this talk, which is to look at the hard realities and the inconvenient truths, as I call them, of Taiwan as an issue in the U.S. China relationship. And this is an issue I've cared about for a long time. I've spent time in Taiwan, I've lived in Taiwan, I've certainly lived in the mainland. And I've paid attention to the issue, special attention to the issue of Taiwan for a long time. And so I wanted to come and give you my candid assessment of what I think is really happening, and to kind of use direct and plain language that we so often don't hear, certainly from the governments, to talk about these issues, and to kind of, if you will, pull back the veneer of these diplomatic formulations and talk about the reality of the relationship. So that's what I want to do. And I'm glad that we have a clock up here, because I want to be cognizant of staying within about 45 minutes, and thus leaving about 45 minutes for what I suspect and hope will be a vigorous discussion and a lot of questions, a lot of good discussion around a very rich topic for sure. So let me just start by saying briefly kind of where the Taiwan issue is, and I won't delve into this in detail, because if you're here in this conference room listening to me speak on this topic, you probably have a very good understanding of the basics of the Taiwan issue. From a mainland perspective, this is unfinished business dating back to 1949, when the Communist Party under the leadership of Mao Zedong took over the mainland, but weren't able to take over or extend that dominion to Taiwan because of the 90 miles of sea in between the mainland and Taiwan. And so from 1949, you've had these parallel entities, the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, or Taiwan, living near each other and side by side, but with the mainland viewing this as a piece of unfinished business dating back to the Revolution and the Chinese Civil War, and obviously Taiwan having a very different take. And as a result, to summarize it, as we all understand, and as is often reported in the media, the sort of line that you always see in every story, China regards Taiwan as a, quote, renegade province. That's the way that journalists typically shorthand it, and that's a pretty good summary of the mindset. And so from China's standpoint, and in a moment I'll talk about the U.S. perspective, and then I'll go into these hard realities and inconvenient truths. From China's standpoint, the bottom line is this: China wants to see Taiwan reunified, as it would put it, with the mainland, flying with the Chinese flag flying over the island of Taiwan. That's what the rightful end state for Taiwan should be, as viewed from a mainland perspective. And China has said, and as a matter of doctrine and repeated many times, that it hopes to achieve that end through peaceful means, but it reserves the right to use force, if necessary, to achieve that national objective. And that's where China stands on it, simply put. The United States position is different. The United States, as a part of the process of normalizing relations with the People's Republic of China on January 1st, 1979, over 40 years ago, said that it wants to see, the United States wants to see peaceful resolution, not peaceful reunification, but peaceful resolution of the cross-strait issues, and furthermore, that we want to see a scenario in which neither side is coerced into doing something it doesn't want to do, neither side is forced by military means to do something it doesn't want to do, and that each side should refrain from acting in a way that unilaterally changes the status quo, and that whatever result is generated should be a result that accords with the will of people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. That's the U.S. position. And so those are the going-in positions of China on the one hand and the United States. And let me reiterate, in this talk, I'm talking about Taiwan as an issue in the U.S. China relationship, but I am very cognizant that Taiwan is not merely an issue in the U.S. China relationship. It is a place that has 24 million people and it has its own sense of identity, and we could do many talks on many subjects related to Taiwan. But here I'm looking at it through the lens and the prism of U.S. China relations. So with that being laid out, let me now go through a list of probably about 6 or 7 hard realities and inconvenient truths that I think need to be discussed more candidly if we want to maximize our chances of maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and minimizing the likelihood of miscalculation or even disastrous miscalculation. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the one China policy of the United States. And I want to point out that there are 3 things about it that I think need to be said and that are not often said. And this is where we start getting to some of the hard realities and inconvenient truths. So the first thing is a very fundamental point, and that is that I think when you really get down to it, let me stress before I even go into this that I'm not speaking for anybody else. I'm just speaking for myself, and I'm giving you my candid analytical assessment. In no way do I purport to speak for the U.S. government. Obviously, I'm not a U.S. government employee anymore. I was some years ago. So I don't speak for anyone other than myself, and that allows me to be very candid and to say things that my good friends in government can't say. So, in my judgment, the declared policy of the United States when it comes to the one China policy does not accurately reflect the actual strategic sentiment of the United States. Now, no government official would say that. A government official, by definition, would say our policy reflects our actual strategic thinking. That's why it's the policy. And what I'm saying is, in my considered estimation, in my considered judgment, that our stated policy actually does not reflect what we really think or what we really want. So we have a one China policy that mandates, by definition, that the United States recognize as the sole legal government of China the government of the People's Republic of China. And that is what we do. And that is why we have an embassy and consulates in the People's Republic of China, where I served earlier in my career. That's why we have a U.S. ambassador in the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And that's why we don't have a, quote, embassy, unquote, or an ambassador, unquote, in Taipei. We have informal, unofficial relations with Taipei, and we extend formal diplomatic recognition to the mainland. But beyond that, this notion that is articulated and expressed in official U.S. policy, which is that the United States is neutral about the ultimate outcome of Taiwan, the ultimate end state of Taiwan, the idea that we're neutral is false. We are not neutral. That's my personal assessment. We say that we're neutral. We say that as long as both sides can agree and if both people on both sides of the strait can embrace a solution and it's a peaceful solution, then we're fine with whatever solution occurs. In reality, we're not. In reality, we're not neutral. In reality, in my opinion, the United States is opposed to reunification. That is the reality. And when Chinese diplomats and scholars and others observe that the United States says one thing but does another, or that the United States seems to not want to see unification, they're right. And it's kind of gaslighting China to say otherwise, in my opinion, but we do that. We, the U.S. government, meaning the U.S. government, does that and says, well, no, our policy is this, and so forth and so on. But the reality is there is a gap between the declared policy and what I think official Washington actually wants. So that's the first hard reality and inconvenient truth. The truth is the United States is willing to do and is doing virtually everything in its power. Not everything, but virtually everything, almost everything in its power, to make reunification harder than it would otherwise be, to prevent it from happening. That is the reality. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second point I want to make is one that I've talked with my good Chinese friends in the mainland about recently in the wake of the Pelosi visit, and something I've talked about over the years as well. And that is something that I think is a bit of a revelation to people in China. And that is that the U.S. executive branches or the U.S. government's one China policy does not, in fact, bind the United States to do any particular thing or to not do any particular thing except one. By definition, The One China policy mandates that the United States recognize as the sole legal government of China the government of the People's Republic of China, and we do that. But other than that, it doesn't have a specific meaning. One of the things that I've talked to my Chinese friends about is that, you often will hear Chinese saying, what the United States is doing, what you're doing, violates your One China policy. And the point I make to them in response is, it is for the United States to judge what does or doesn't violate its own policy. By definition, the United States has the prerogative, by definition, to understand and interpret and execute its own One China policy as it sees fit, by definition. Just as China has absolutely the same right and prerogative to understand, interpret, and execute its policies, including its One China principle, as it refers to it, and respond to U.S. actions as it sees fit. But any critique on the part of China that the United States is not adhering to its own policy is problematic because it is for the United States to define that policy. And what's interesting, and what was, I think, a revelation to some of my Chinese friends, is the United States isn't compelled to follow its own policy. And what we've seen over the last several decades is that the United States, in fact, has changed the way it understands, interprets, and executes its own One China policy. That is true. The policy is still there. It's called the same thing. It's true, it's a truism, if you will, when a government spokesman in this country says, we still embrace the One China policy. But it begs the question of how do we understand, interpret, and execute the policy? And the reality is it has changed. And the reality is the United States can do pretty much whatever it sees fit to do, in my judgment, within the constraints of one thing, extending formal diplomatic recognition to the mainland and not extending formal diplomatic recognition to Taiwan. Beyond that, who visits Taiwan or who from Taiwan visits the U.S., what building they meet in, and so forth and so on are all questions of interpretation. And guess what? It's the United States that gets to interpret those matters because it's our policy. So the notion that the policy is not binding is something that I think Chinese have not really thought about. The thing that I point out is that the policy is a policy. It is not a law. It is not a Senate-ratified treaty that has the force of law. It can change. It has changed. It will continue to change and evolve. And by the way, let's not lose sight of the fact that China's own behavior relative to Taiwan has also changed, which is one of the reasons that you've seen some of the changes, I think, in U.S. policy. Let me also parenthetically note that one of the most interesting and frustrating dynamics in the relationship between the United States and China when it comes to Taiwan is that each side, the United States and China, believes that what it's doing is a response to what the other side was doing first. China believes that its increasingly aggressive stance toward Taiwan is an appropriate reaction to things that the United States has done. And the United States believes exactly the opposite, that what we're doing to change the way we implement the policy is a direct response to some of the aggressiveness that we now see on the part of the mainland toward Taiwan. And I don't think that either side will ever successfully convince the other side that they're right and the other side is wrong. So that's the second point. And again, that is a hard reality and that is an inconvenient truth, it's particularly when viewed from a mainland perspective. The third point that I want to make also relates to the One China policy, but it's a different point. And that is, even if one were to make the argument that the One China policy is, quote, binding on the United States, which in a legal sense it's obviously not, there's an interesting question. Is it binding upon Congress? And the answer to that is no, it's not. So Chinese often express surprise at the notion that a leader from the United States Congress, such as Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi or others, or for that matter, any member of Congress, can travel to Taiwan notwithstanding the existence of what the United States refers to as the One China policy. But what it shows is what we all know, that the executive branch does not have the power to tell members of Congress where they can or can't travel so long as they're traveling someplace within the constraints of U.S. law. Only U.S. law can say what you can or can't do. The President of the United States can't tell any member of Congress where he or she can go or not go, beyond what the laws of our nation say. And likewise, Congress can't tell the President what the President should do. We have separate but equal, if you will, branches of power, branches of the U.S. government, and they can operate very independently of each other. So when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan, she was, in my judgment, certainly demonstrating the fact that the Speaker of the House and any member of Congress can do what they want to do without the President being able to stop them. President Biden noted that, and he was right. Whether he wanted to see the visit, didn't want to see the visit, the reality was he didn't have any way to stop that visit from happening because he doesn't have the constitutional authority to do so. And it makes clear that, as one example among others that could be cited, that the United States Congress can understand U.S. policy in its own way and can act in accordance with that policy as Congress understands the policy, or in ways that diverge from that policy. And China would certainly make the argument, and I would say some in the United States might also make the argument, that Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan represented a significant departure from U.S. policy. I'll come back to that point in a second. But you can't make that argument if you recognize the fundamental truth, the hard truth and the inconvenient truth, that Congress is not bound by this policy. And that is also, I think, a revelation to our friends in China. Let me also point out something that was really interesting and that exemplifies this point, but was not widely reported, maybe because people missed it or just didn't register, but I noticed it right away, and that is that when Speaker Pelosi was in Taiwan, at one point she was interviewed by a journalist, and in her response on the record to a journalist, to a question from a journalist, she referred to Taiwan as a country. Now, from the standpoint of the one China policy, that is a no-no. You can't do that. Meaning the executive branch of the United States, you'll never hear the U.S. president, except possibly inadvertently, and that has happened, but you'll never hear the U.S. president refer to Taiwan as a country, per se. Nor will you hear the U.S. Secretary of State, nor will you hear any other executive branch official do that. Because we do not recognize as a nation, our U.S. government, under Republican and Democratic administrations, do not recognize Taiwan as a country. And Speaker Pelosi specifically referred to Taiwan as a country. Now that is an absolute abrogation of U.S. one China policy, and guess what? She has every right to do that because she is not bound by that policy. And when I explained that to my friends in China, they were pretty shocked. And it was a realization that I think had not fully set in. So these are some of the things that U.S. government spokesmen are not going to say, but they are true, and they need to be said if we're all going to have a deeper understanding of some of these issues. Now let me say a little bit, continuing with the theme of hard realities and inconvenient truths, about Taiwan's sentiment with respect to the issue of unification / as the mainland would say, reunification. And I'll put it very simply. The bottom line is nobody in Taiwan wants reunification, period. It's just as simple as that. The last poll that I saw, an authoritative poll from Taiwan, measured the number of people who are for unification with China in the near future at 1.3%. I've tracked this data for 30 years since I first went into the U.S. government. I know the data very well. The trend line has been steady and absolutely clear. With each passing year, fewer people in Taiwan have any desire whatsoever to reunify or unify with the mainland. It's as simple as that. And if you add up folks that even leave open the possibility of a closer relationship or unification with China in the future, it comes to no more than about 5% of the population, meaning 95% of the population just don't want it. So, what is the implication of that? It means that the only way, and this is again a hard reality, particularly when viewed from the mainland perspective, the only way that Taiwan is ever going to be unified with the mainland is through the use of force. Period. That's it. It will not happen under any other circumstances. There will never be sentiment in for unification under any circumstances. People that have the kind of freedoms that people in Taiwan currently enjoy never voluntarily give up those freedoms. There's no precedent for it, and it's not going to happen. So when China says, as a matter of declared doctrine, that it is for peaceful reunification, but it will not take the use of force off the table, and that is the well-established position of China, and I think it's a credible position. What they have to understand in the mainland is ultimately they are going to have to use force to achieve their stated objective. There is no other way because the sentiment is not there. China has put forward a model, a framework called One Country, Two Systems, which I think probably most people in this room have heard. The idea that, again, as stated from a mainland perspective, you, Taiwan, join our nation, rejoin, reunify, we fly the flag, but you get to have your own system, your own form of government, your own economy, and so forth and so on. One country, two systems. As I said in the 2013 report and in testimony on Capitol Hill in 2014, if the people of Taiwan wanted one country, two systems, they would already have it. They don't want it. And by the way, what's happened in Hong Kong over the last 2 years since the advent and adoption of the National Security Law in June of 2020, just over 2 years ago, has further undermined any confidence that people in Taiwan have that China would live up to a notion or construct of one country, two systems. Because people in Taiwan have seen that the kind of freedoms that would be ostensibly protected have been eroded in Hong Kong as a result of the adoption of that law. So China has to come to the realization, I would say the hard and perhaps painful realization, that the only way it's ever going to get Taiwan back is through applying the use of force and forcing Taiwan via military means to accept this, something that they don't want. So that's a reality that we have to talk about that is rooted in Taiwan's sentiment, well-established sentiment that I think is not going anywhere. The next point that I would make is a hard reality about what I refer to as the fundamental Chinese conundrum when it comes to the issue of Taiwan. And it is really in a double bind, and it's something that by definition they can't get out of for the reasons that you'll see. On the one hand, China has said that they want peaceful reunification, but will use force if necessary or if certain red lines are crossed, i.e. a declaration of independence and so on. And so the threat of force is part of Chinese policy, it is part of the Chinese posture, and it is on the table. And that threat of force, by definition, alienates the very people whose hearts China is trying to win to get them to come back into the fold through peaceful means. And yet, if China were to take the threat of force off the table, Taiwan would be independent tomorrow, without a doubt. And so it is a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario from a mainland standpoint. You keep the threat of force and you ensure that the people in Taiwan will never want to be reunified. You get rid of the threat of force and you ensure that Taiwan goes independent, essentially immediately. You cannot get out of that double bind if you're China. And that is a harsh reality for the Chinese, and there is no answer to it. So it's one of the things that's not often said out loud, but it is, in my judgment, a very clear reality that China has to deal with. Now let me talk a little bit about a conundrum that the United States faces, which is also a hard reality. And that is, as we all know, the United States sells defense articles and services to Taiwan periodically. In fact, the U.S. government just announced the most recent batch. And I've long been on the record in favor of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan because I think they're constructive and stabilizing. China would absolutely disagree with that. They'd be against arms sales and think that they're destabilizing. But I think that I've been supportive of that posture for many, many years on the record. And the United States sells arms to Taiwan. But here's the conundrum, and here's the reality. The United States can't sell Taiwan enough arms to arm Taiwan out of its security dilemma with the mainland. That is the bottom line. There is not the political appetite in Washington, even in Washington, to sell Taiwan or make available to Taiwan arms and capabilities sufficient to create anything approaching parity when it comes to the military balance of power across the strait. We can't do it. Even the hardliners in Washington don't have the appetite to do it. If you look back at the last 40 years, we've generally made available to Taiwan approximately just over $1 billion worth of stuff arriving on the shores of Taiwan every year on average for the last 40 years. And in recent years, it's ticked up to maybe 1.5 billion or even 2 billion. But the disparity in military power across the strait is not something that $1 or $2 billion a year worth of hardware can resolve, period. Everyone knows, everyone understands that the People's Republic of China today is not where it was in 1979 from a military capability standpoint. China has grown at a geometric rate, but Taiwan's capabilities have increased only at an arithmetic rate. And those numbers just don't work. So much as we might like as a nation to help our partner and our fellow democracy and our friend Taiwan, the reality is we can't and won't give them enough arms to arm them out of their security dilemma. As a matter of fact, the United States and Taiwan don't even agree on what arms should be provided. There have been reports on that recently, where Taiwan wants to buy kind of heavier equipment that it believes would be more useful in a potential conflict with the mainland. The United States places an emphasis on asymmetric capabilities that are different, and by the way, at a lower price point. And even the United States and Taiwan simply don't agree and have to work through some of these very complex issues. But the truth is, the imbalance of power is going to be there, and there's nothing the United States can do about it. And that's something we have to recognize. This leads me to perhaps the most fundamental point, and it's one that I've spent a long time trying to talk to my friends in China about, trying to help them understand something that I think originally they really didn't understand. If you talk to folks from the mainland, much of the time they will say, if it weren't for the United States, the issue of Taiwan would have long since been resolved. You're the ones, America, that are gumming up the works. You're the ones that are preventing this. You're the ones that are standing in the way of the realization of the will of people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. We're all brothers and sisters, and if it weren't for your meddling, America, we would have this problem with it. What I've told the Chinese is the United States is not the problem, believe it or not. The United States is a symptom of the problem. What the problem really is the existential and permanent incompatibility of the two systems, period. It's as simple as that. And one thing I've pointed out that I don't think anyone else has ever noted or written about or spoken about, but I pointed this out in the 2013 report that I did on the topic of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, is that when you look at the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, and you look at Article 1 of the Constitution of the PRC, the Constitution refers to China's regime type, as a dictatorship, namely a people's democratic dictatorship. That is the exact phrase in Chinese and in English, in the official English that is published by the Chinese. And if you look at Article 1 of the Taiwan Constitution, the ROC, Republic of China Constitution, Article 1 says that Taiwan's, or the Republic of China's, as it puts it, regime type is a republican democracy of, by, and for the people. It's almost as if that phrase in English, and even in Chinese, was written to satisfy the imperative of bipartisanship in the U.S. political context. And thus both the words Republican and Democratic were placed into Article 1, and of, by, and for the people, of course, goes back to Abraham Lincoln. So the point that I make is, and this is kind of true at the level of symbolism, and it's true at a literal level, a textual level as well. China's system is unconstitutional in Taiwan, and Taiwan's system is unconstitutional in the People's Republic of China, in the mainland. So you were dealing with a constitutional and existential incompatibility of system. I pointed out to the Chinese, because I often am able to cite their constitution in more detail than many people in China, because I've studied it pretty closely. I pointed out that for one country, two systems to work within the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, you'd have to amend the People's Republic of China's Constitution. I mean, that's how fundamental the difference is. But it's more than that. It's the political system, it's the social system, it's the economic system, it's the way society, the rhythm of society, the expression of religious beliefs, and a long, long list of things in which the truth, the hard truth is, certainly from a mainland perspective, the mainland and Taiwan are really, really different places in so many profound ways. And it is essentially an unbridgeable gap at this point. And that's something that it's taken, I think, people in the mainland a long time to come to understand. But I think over the years, as exchanges between Taiwan and the mainland have occurred, people in the mainland have come to understand these places are really, really different. And so the existential problem, core problem, is not the United States. The United States is involved because these differences exist. If these differences didn't exist, the United States would not be involved in the way that it is in these issues. So that's kind of a bitter pill in some ways for my friends in China to swallow, but it is true, and I think more and more people understand it. Let me just say a little bit as I start to wrap up here about the issue of the degree to which Russia's unlawful, naked, unprovoked, and unjustified and horrible aggression against Ukraine does or doesn't increase the likelihood that China might go into Taiwan, because that is a big question that's been on people's minds since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, and obviously that is ongoing. And I want to say a little bit about my assessment of the calculus of the leadership of China, of the mainland, when it comes to this issue. So the way I often put it is every day that we wake up and China hasn't gone into Taiwan is a day that, in my view, the leadership assesses, the Chinese leadership assesses that the costs of going into Taiwan outweigh the benefits of doing so, by definition. And that if ever the Chinese leadership were to wake up one morning and say, oddly enough, I now think that the benefits outweigh the costs, my argument is they would then do it. Because why would you not do something where the benefits, by your own assessment, outweigh the costs? So every day that this doesn't happen is a day that China clearly believes it is not in its interests to do this, that the costs outweigh the benefits. If that assessment on my part is correct, then I think that China is getting it right, because I agree that the costs would be prohibitive for China from its perspective. And that's why, in my judgment, they don't do it. And the point that I would make with respect to Russia and Ukraine is that the Russia-Ukraine situation does nothing to change that fundamental calculus. But that calculus still holds. That China today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day after that and next month and for a long time to come is going to believe that the costs of going into Taiwan militarily outweigh the benefits of doing so. So there are other things one could say about the ripple effects of Russia-Ukraine, but I think fundamentally it doesn't change the equation for China. Now, one thing that it does show, and again, the Russia-Ukraine situation, is what a template for a Western reaction to this kind of thing might look like. And one thing that's very clear is when Russia went into Ukraine, one of the very first things that President Biden said as President of the United States was, we are not going to fight Russia over this issue, period. We're not going to do it. And he put that on the table as much to communicate with Russia as to communicate with the American people in the world. He said, we are not going to fight Russia over this. Full stop. That's it. Now, we're going to figure out what we are going to do in terms of economic punishments, sanctions, UN activities, diplomacy, and so forth and so on, including making arms available and so forth. But we are not going to fight World War III over this issue. And I think China looks at that, and I think the world looks at that. I think many observers look at the U.S. and the NATO reaction obviously with U.S. de facto as the leader of that alliance, and say this is a pretty good model for a Western reaction and a world reaction to a Taiwan scenario. And so this leads me to an inconvenient truth. I don't think China is going to go into Taiwan for the reasons that I've mentioned. The costs that would be imposed would be principally economic and would turn China into a pariah state for a long, long time to come. And I don't think China wants to go down that road, and that's why China doesn't go into Taiwan. But I think it's also clear to China and to others that the United States, in all likelihood, would not enter into direct conflict over this issue any more than the United States and its allies have done so with respect to Ukraine. And we don't have a NATO per se in Asia, although NATO has commented on events in Asia and on China specifically. But we have NATO, we have this incredible, the greatest alliance in the history of the world, the most powerful military alliance in the history of the world. And we are not doing anything in terms of direct military confrontation relative to Russia. It is even more unlikely that absent the greatest alliance in the theater in question, we would do something different in terms of China in the Taiwan scenario. So the bottom line is, I don't think we're going to see conflagration across the Taiwan Strait anytime soon. I predict it will be the indefinite future will be a future in which there is not military conflict generated by the Taiwan Strait situation. The costs are going to be too high for China in its own assessment, in my opinion, for as far as the eye can see. Those costs would mainly be economic, they would mainly be sanctions and the whole list of things and more that Russia has dealt with as a result of its actions in Ukraine. And I think that is enough to deter China from going down that road. And one of the points, and I'll wrap up here in just about 2 minutes or so, one of the points that people often make when they talk about Taiwan is that this is a legacy issue for the leadership of China, and that the idea is by taking Taiwan, that it would enhance the legitimacy of the ruling party of the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party of China, and that it would enhance the leadership credentials of the leadership of China. By the same token, failing to achieve reunification could be a very, very serious blow to both of those things. And I think that it is a double-edged sword, such that the leadership of China is going to take a look at the Russia-Ukraine scenario, for example, and also much more fundamentally into the point, look at the cross-strait balance of power and the various factors that are in play, and judge that if China falters, if it were to make a military move, and if it were to falter in the way that Russia appears to be faltering in taking over a much weaker neighbor that it's contiguous to, if China were to falter in such an effort, it could actually cost the Communist Party its leadership of China forever. It could actually result in the end of communist rule on the mainland potentially. I think that is also a factor that lends additional weight to the idea that China needs to be very, very sure that they can be successful before they would embark on this type of thing. And candidly, going back to my earlier point, the United States policy, in my judgment, this is not the declared policy, but the United States policy, in my judgment, in actuality, is to do everything in our human power to make sure that the cost-benefit analysis ends up with more costs than benefits from a Chinese standpoint. And we will do all in our power to contribute to the cost side of that equation. Now, that's not our stated and declared policy, but that is the reality, I think, of where American strategic sentiment is. So the conclusion I would draw is this, and we have 40 minutes left, and I really look forward to your questions and comments and so on. The conclusion is, this is a really important issue. It has the potential to conflagrate. When I was writing about major international conflicts some years ago, I pointed out that you need 5 things in place, and I've done a talk on this over the years a number of times, to have the potential for major international conflict. You need at least one state. You need at least one autocracy. You need at least one non-nuclear power. You need at least one power that regards itself as exceptional. And you need an existential interest. And if you have those 5 things, you have the potential for major international conflict. If you lack any one of them, you don't. The mainland Taiwan situation and dynamic has all of those 5 elements. So it is potentially a very serious source of conflict. But if we communicate more honestly, more openly, with greater sincerity, with a willingness to say things that are sometimes hard to hear and sometimes hard to say, we can do a pretty good job of minimizing the likelihood of an outcome that none of us want. Thank you so much.